BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast. It's Rally Day in London as thousands of farmers are expected to gather in Westminster. We take stock of the budget changes and drill into the detail of the figures. First, though, today, the mega meeting marathon that is COP29 has been taking place in Baku, capital of Azerbaijan. Aimed at pulling together countries to agree how to tackle climate change, today it's concentrating on food and farming. The Prime Minister Keir Starmer told the conference the UK will now aim for an 81% cut in its emissions by 2035. And farming has to be part of the way the UK reaches that target. I asked our climate and science reporter Esme Stallard what's on the agenda for food and farming today at COP29.
So this is the second year we've had a day dedicated to food and farming specifically. So throughout the 2 weeks that we're here at the Climate Summit, there are ongoing negotiations around farming. But the idea of having a particular day means that there can be a focus in terms of exchanging ideas amongst different countries and in different organisations. So, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organisation is here, and they'll be doing lots of events on the day showcasing the work that they're doing around lots of different issues to do with farming, whether that be genetic resources, whether that be to do with emissions reduction, whether that be to do with water resistance, for example. So there'll be those events going on. But we're also expecting later today the President to make an announcement of a new initiative on this issue. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to contain, but as an example, last year there was a UAE food systems declaration, and that effectively committed 160 countries to making sure that agriculture was in their climate plans when they were making emissions targets. What does that actually mean for the food sector?
We've been hearing that this COP is about money, really. The NFU described it to us as the finance COP. Are nations making extra funding available to improve their agriculture systems to meet climate targets?
Exactly. So the main aim or goal for this year's COP is about all countries agreeing to give more money for climate change. Now, previously there was this global commitment that richer countries would give 100 billion by 2020 to poorer nations. Now, that target was eventually reached in 2023, but now we don't have a target. So this overall goal is about richer countries giving more money to developing nations. Now, the detail of that really needs to be ironed out. We're really still at the early stages, even though we're into the second week. Eventually, the text, maybe not this time, but in Brazil, might identify certain areas where that money might go. So, for example, farming. But what does it actually mean for developed nations or countries like the UK, for example? Well, that's where the national plans really become a key focus. So there's a real issue with getting the money that's pledged at a really large global scale actually down to the farm level.
What about the delegation from the USA? President-elect Donald Trump has named his new energy secretary, Chris Wright. Now, he's a climate change sceptic. Will that affect what's on the table at this COP?
I think the biggest concern at the moment is that one of the key areas of funding for farming actually comes via this UAE-US initiative called AIM. It stands for the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. So it was launched a few years ago, and what the UAE and US were doing was trying to get money from governments, from companies, so not just governments but other organisations, and getting them to commit money to help adjust agriculture to be able to deal with a warming world and also to help them reduce emissions. Now, so far that project has managed to do 130 schemes using $30 billion. Now, the concern is that comes to an end next year, and if the US, not only the Energy Secretary but Trump himself, is a sceptic of climate change, does that mean they won't recommit to schemes like that? And obviously the US is a big funder for research in farming and also efforts to try and implement some of this research. So there is concern that there might be a bit of a financial shortfall within the sector, and I think that's something to be looking out for in the next few months.
BBC climate and science reporter Esme Stallard in Baku. This morning, thousands of farmers from around the country will be gathering in London for two events to express their dismay at the changes in tax arrangements, which many say could destroy what they describe as family farms. I'll be at both events and will bring you a full report about it tomorrow morning. In a moment, we'll delve into the detail of the actual tax changes themselves. But first, let's have a reminder of how this came about. Almost exactly a month ago, Budget Day, October the 20th, Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced that farmland, farm buildings and assets will no longer be free from inheritance tax, an exemption brought in under Margaret Thatcher in 1984. DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed defended the changes. He told Farming Today why.
I don't think it helps farmers or anybody else if wealthy individuals are able to buy up land as a means of avoiding their inheritance tax liability. But it isn't just that. We think the wealthiest landowners and the wealthiest people in the sector can afford to contribute more at that point. But I said we're going to be fair and proportionate in doing this. And under the changes that have been proposed, 73% of claimants will still pay nothing at all in inheritance tax.
And we'll come on to the disputed figures about how many will have to pay the tax in just a moment. But it wasn't just introducing inheritance tax that angered farmers. The budget also announced that the rate of ending old EU payments to farmers will be sped up. President of the NFU, Tom Bradshaw, told us he could feel the anger at the budget announcements.
There are many, many family farms that are worried for their future. The calls I've been receiving from people in their middle age that have been running a very successful business, but for very good reasons. Their parents are still in the family house. They're still partners in the business because that was the right thing to do for tax planning, are caught in the eye of this storm, and they might not live 7 years. There's no way through it for them. I have never seen the weight of support, the strength of feeling and anger that there is in this industry today.
Tom Bradshaw there speaking after meeting with the DEFRA Secretary 2 weeks ago. And since then, thousands of farmers have committed to taking action today. Well, some will meet their MPs to explain their position, and others will be joining a rally to voice their feelings. For many, it's not just inheritance tax, but changes in the new payment scheme, which they say is leaving them fewer options to keep their businesses afloat. Upland farmer John Atkinson told us there are no options for environmental schemes for him because he already has protected areas on his land.
We've got assets, but we can borrow against them, but we can't sell them overnight or whatever. So it is quite difficult. And the government said they want to support farmers to produce public goods and to protect the environment. And it seems like they're doing everything to stop us. We're really, really struggling to keep going.
Well, also on the programme, we heard from economist and dairy expert Rob Hitch, who pointed out that farmers have opportunities to mitigate their tax burden, including passing over assets within 7 years of the death of the owner. He told us about his traffic light system for future planning.
I've got a green light for anyone that's basically 60 or younger. You can plan at that point in time. The people in the amber category are effectively probably between 60 and 70 or 75. They should live 7 years. They can make gifts. They can do things. The category in the red light section are probably those over 70 or 75. We've had the same rules for 40 years and then suddenly they changed overnight. It's like having the goalposts moved when you're finally ready to die. Those sort of people don't have the opportunity to give it and be secure that they will live 7 years and drop it out of their estate.
We've also been hearing responses from listeners to Farming Today, farmers and non-farmers alike.
Madeline Thomas emailed saying, please be aware there are benefits to scrapping the agricultural relief on inheritance tax, such as it will hopefully bring the price of land down, bringing new entrants to farming, lower farm rents and hopefully move some older farmers on in the first place. Jory Rob emailed too. I'm over 80, have never been married, have no one to make a gift of money to and own one small flat. My estate will be taxed. So why should farmers aged 80 plus be exempt, but not me?
Those are just some of the reactions to the budget announcement we've been hearing over the last 4 weeks. Well, one of the points of dispute around the tax is how many farmers will have to pay it. It seems the Treasury and the NFU have quite different assessments of this. Farmers claim about 2/3 of family farms will be impacted by the change. The Treasury says that 73% of APR claims will not be affected. And as ever, the devil is in the detail. Well, our producer Heather Simons has been telling me it is complicated.
First of all, I've got some three-letter acronyms for you. APR is Agricultural Property Relief and BPR is Business Property Relief. Before the new rules come into force in April 2026, farm business owners can claim 100% APR and BPR when passing on the business to their relatives upon death, i.e. no inheritance tax. Now that relief has been reduced, meaning inheritance tax will be introduced on agricultural businesses worth more than £1 million. The thing that makes all this confusing is that APR and BPR are a bit interchangeable. One farm business can claim both reliefs on different aspects of the property, and on some things, like the value of land and farm buildings, you can claim APR or BPR.
So why is that relevant?
Well, it means that figures looking at just APR don't tell the whole story. The government keeps using this 73% figure, but that is about APR claims. Specifically, 73% of the APR claims in the year 2021-22 were on less than £1 million worth of assets. So the Treasury says they won't be impacted by the change in the rules. But you could have someone claiming less than £1 million in APR, but also claiming, for the sake of argument, £3 million in BPR. They would count towards that 73% figure of people who, the Treasury say, wouldn't be impacted by the change in the rules. But of course they would be impacted by the change because the £1 million threshold is across both reliefs. So that 73% figure is just not very meaningful when it comes to the concerns being raised by farmers. Now, just yesterday, the Treasury released more data, this time saying that looking at estates claiming APR and BPR where applicable, 78% of claims made by estates were worth less than 1.5 million. But it's worth noting that a lot of the people claiming APR won't be farmers. The Treasury pointed out to me that some of the claims for a small amount of APR might just refer to a couple of horses in a paddock, bumping up that proportion of claims that are on less than £1 million worth of assets.
So do we know how many farmers will be impacted then?
Well, not really. I did try to get some more relevant figures, but it's hard, to be honest. The Treasury has made predictions for claims that will be made from 2026 when the new rules come in. And they predict from the estates claiming some combination of APR and BPR, either just one or the other or both, there will be 2,000 affected by the changes and 3,100 unaffected. Of the 2,000 affected, the Treasury tell me 1,000 are to do with something called AIM shares and are nothing to do with farm businesses, so we'll leave them to one side. That leaves 1,000 claimants impacted, but there's nothing to say how many of them are farms and how many are other types of business being passed on to family, because that data isn't collected. So basically, we don't know.
And the NFU says the majority of farms will be impacted. So where's that come from?
Yeah, and that's not straightforward either, because they're using DEFRA data about the value of farm businesses. They say 2/3 of farms are worth more than £1 million, so could be affected. And at first glance, that feels more relevant. But some farm businesses have multiple owners. So for the sake of argument, you could have a farm business worth £5 million, but if it's owned equally by 5 family members, then they each own £1 million worth, so we'd all be able to pass that on without paying inheritance tax. So that data also doesn't really get to the bottom of the question.
Our producer Heather Simons, who's happiest digging into the figures there. That's all from us today. More on the farmer rally and protests in tomorrow's programme. I'm Anna Hill. The producer is Rebecca Rooney. And don't forget, Farming Today is with you weekday mornings from 5:45. You can set your smart speaker routine to play Radio 4 and wake up with us.